Okay, and welcome to our fifth lecture of the semester. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the fourth. I know it's a fifth lecture, and we're talking about the fourth thing, but we're talking about the fourth stage, at least in our model, which is called action planning. And this will be one of the shorter lectures in the grand scheme of things as well. But action planning, again, as I mentioned a second ago, is the fourth stage of our model that we're using for this class. And just as a kind of a refresher, the first three stages are stage one, which is problem analysis, and stage two, which is the goals and the objectives, and then stage three, which is what we finished talking about in the prior lecture, that is program or policy design. So in short, what we're hoping to achieve at this stage is we have the new program or the policy designed from, again, the prior lecture, and we're ready to put this plan into motion. So if you're analyzing an existing plan, you're going to need to collect information to determine how critical decisions are made or how they were made to implement the program. So specifically here with action planning is defined as charting the entire sequence of activities and completion dates required to implement the program or policy design. So what it does is it involves specifying in clear and concise detail. Again, remember that kind of consistent thing that we've talked about all semester long, being as specific as possible, the steps that are required to implement the program or policy design. So it is, in essence, again here, a blueprint to explaining how to translate a vision of your program or your policy into reality. So again, think about it like an instruction manual, as I mentioned earlier, and you don't want somebody that is assembling your instruction manual to be missing any steps along the way. As I mentioned in the prior lecture, I can't tell you how many pieces of furniture I've built, and a lot of it is probably user error, but where I go back and I'm like, why do I have extra pieces? And you're like, well, they didn't say to put this this part here at this stage, right? So again, think about developing an action plan like an instruction manual for a Lego set or a furniture piece from IKEA. It's going to detail every bit of information involved and how the plan is going to be carried out from start to finish. So by the end of reading this action plan, the Lego set or the piece of furniture should be built fully and it should be final. You shouldn't have extra pieces, right? So the questions, again, if you want to think about it in terms of Lego set and or furniture, is it sturdy, or is there anything that I could have done to improve it as well? And think about that as really that revision stage. So once your action plan is done, to go back and reread it constantly to make sure that everything is as clear and concise as possible. And as with anything, like what I do in some cases, have somebody read your rough draft, right? To make sure, especially somebody that's not even involved in that at all. So it's got a new pair of eyes on it, and they can read it from an outsider's perspective and give you some honest feedback. So again, it's important to keep in mind here, if we're continuing with that analogy with a Lego set or with furniture, if having all the pieces of a Lego set or furniture won't really do you any good, again, if there's not clear instructions on how to assemble it. And again, just keep that stuff in mind to be as clear as possible, as detailed as possible. And if that's the case, then you won't run into any problems, and people implementing your program or your policy won't run into as many problems either. They're still probably going to run into some problems, but nowhere near probably the level that they would have. So as far as implementation, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, implementation is the initiation, management, and administration of the action plan. So once the program or policy actually begins, we want to minimize discrepancies between what was planned, so the program or policy design, and what was actually done. So this is going to be the program or policy and action. So the blueprint that we were talking about earlier really has to be methodically specified to inform every one of the sequence of tasks that need to be completed to launch or implement the program or policy successfully. So again here, the better you plan, the more you can minimize unanticipated problems that could surface from the program or the policy once it begins. So again, the implementation is putting all your hard work into motion to see if it actually works in the way that it's supposed to. So then we have to identify the resources that are needed for your program or your policy, and then you have to make cost projections as well. So all resources that are needed for the implementation of the intervention need to be identified up front. So resources here can include financial resources, personnel resources as well. So the first step really in this process is developing what is called a resource plan. And a resource plan is a comprehensive statement of the specific fiscal, so your financial, your material, and your social resources that are required to implement an intervention. So all program or policy costs are estimated, including personnel, training, equipment, facilities, supplies, travel, and everything else that you can include. Technology, which is included in equipment, is important, but keep in mind with technology costs, you have to refresh technology, right? Every couple of years, you have to refresh it, or you at least have to have a really detailed IT department that has good contracts. I've run into that as a professor. I won't tell you which university, you could probably guess, but one university that I've worked at does not have a tech refresh program. So they just keep repairing 10-year-old laptops that should have not been used about 5 years prior to that, which is just, it's stupid, right? So you gotta incorporate that into this stuff. A lot of this again is stuff that we probably haven't had to think about before. But again, it's something that you need to think about, because if you got a couple $1,000s to buy all your new employees, iPads or laptops, that stuff breaks. That stuff gets old. In my experience, usually laptops start slowing down drastically after about 2 years, and of course the battery stops working in a lot of them too. And so you've got to keep that in mind. It's not going to last forever. So there are 4 goals that we have to achieve with this resource plan. So the first one is that it has to match the resources to the objectives, right? So what this means is one has to carefully ensure that all the resources that are necessary to achieve the objectives of the program or policy are in place. So it forces us to impose really a test of feasibility. So either resources must rise to the level that are needed to achieve the stated objectives of the program or the policy, or the objectives have to be downscaled to match the level of resources available. In all honesty, although that's not the most ideal, that's usually the most logic outcome there, that you're going to have to lower kind of your standards to match the resources that are available. Maybe, and again, I have a more pessimistic viewpoint in many ways, or I say it's more realistic, but some people that are a little bit more optimistic would like to set their objectives a little bit higher, and then they're going to work, they claim they'll work harder to go out and try to raise that money to bridge those gaps of resources, if you will. The second goal is you have to identify the availability of current resources and resources that are still needed to implement the program or policy design properly. So again, this is another crucial aspect to make sure that your resource plan is really solid. The third one is that it attempts to control expenditures. So usually by specifying how much money is to be spent over specific periods of time. So typically, it might be quarterly, which is if you break a 12-month year, into quarters, so 25%, it's 3 months each section. So it could be quarterly. It could be like a university where you have a fiscal year, and I know like Loyola, for example, their fiscal year begins July 1st, and it goes through the end of June of the following year. So the budget for the next year has to be finalized by June, which some universities do a fiscal year, like an academic year, from like August to the end of the July. Some do it as a actual calendar year, like January through the end of December. So it really just kind of depends, but quarterly usually makes a little bit more sense, especially for something like what we're talking about in this class. And then the fourth is that it provides data for monitoring fiscal aspects of the program or policy, and then providing feedback to funding sources and other stakeholders. So this can be annual reports or quarterly grant reports. One of the things that I've mentioned before, and I know I'm going to mention especially as we get deeper into this class, is that now most funding, whether it be state, federal, or grants, they are going to require you to come up with an annual report. They're going to require you to have quarterly reports, because if they're giving you money, they want to know how it is being spent, and how it's being spent effectively. Because unfortunately, there are a lot of times where this money can be misappropriated. I'll give you an example. If you look at a lot of the funding for law enforcement in the 90s, that's still going on to an extent, that was supposed to be used for training, and it was supposed to be used for providing equipment to law enforcement to do their jobs better, and again, provide training and all these other things. They've done an analysis of that, and in fact, the vast majority of it's like 90% of it went to pay police overtime. NOPD has had a problem with that, a recurring problem with that. I've seen some news reports where there's some police officers making over $100 and something thousand a year, and it's mostly from overtime. And then some of that overtime has been earned while they're supposed to be on the clock for NOPD. So, how does that work out, right? But giving another example, when I was at the University of Louisville, there was a professor that was in the medical school that had a huge grant from the federal government to do research on gerontology, which is a study of the elderly. And his administrative assistant started noticing him coming in, and he made a good income, by the way. So he made, I think his annual income was around $150,000 a year or so. Maybe closer to 200,000, but he started coming into the office wearing Armani suits and Gucci suits, and he bought a second house. He started flying to Las Vegas on the weekends in a private jet to participate in poker tournaments. He was going on all these lavish vacations. And, the antennas, of course, went up on the administrative assistant, and she was also in charge of doing a lot of the budgeting for the grant, and noticed that there was a lot of money missing. So what did she do? She reported it, and they looked into it, and they found that, yes, he had spent the vast majority of the money that was supposed to be in the grant for his personal needs. He was paying his ex-wife's alimony with it, for example, as well. So, of course, if you're a funding agency, you don't want people to misspend your funding on their habits, right? So he went to federal prison. So just put that out there. That is why these fiscal reports are done. So when you're doing all of this, you can use all kinds of fancy accounting models that are really outside of the scope of this class, but all of it really breaks down into two tasks. You want to identify the kinds of resources that are needed, and then you want to estimate the cost for each type of resources that are needed. I want to put this out there as well. A lot of times too, because again, I'm not an accountant. I wish I was. I'd be making probably a lot more money than I am now. But if something, especially like this from a financial standpoint, is outside of your scope, it's outside of your expertise, which most of the time it is, usually you can either hire an accounting firm to run this stuff for you. But the easiest thing is if you're a criminal justice agency or you're some other type of agency, you usually have a grants office, and you can just run it out of them, and they're in charge of all of this. They usually have somebody that has the financial background to do this. So piggyback off of pre-existing resources, because that's usually what happens. Like at a university like Loyola, we don't have a huge grants office. We have, I think, one person, maybe two people in it. Most universities have one that's at least around 5 to 10, 15 people. That's what their job is to manage this money. And most agencies now are not going to give you that money unless there's an in-house organization that is already going to handle that money. They're going to take care of all the costs. They're going to take care of all the expenditures. They're going to keep track of it. They won't even. You actually have to articulate that in grant proposals. But again, basically, you want to identify resources that are needed and also estimate cost for each types of these resources. So here you want to have a list of everything that's going to cost money. So you're going to want to have your staff. So how many staff, what qualifications the staff need to have, staff training, so what kind of training, how much will be needed, how often will they have to do it, are there going to be professional development opportunities, supplies like office supplies, computers as we've talked about earlier, advertising, so brochures, flyers, commercials, public service announcements, Facebook ads, right? Equipment, so you want to look at as well, this could be supplies / equipment, but computers, tablets, phones, rental costs, so office space, of course, is important. And it's expensive, right? Interviewing rooms. So if you're wanting to do, interviews, you need a secluded space for this. You don't need to do it in a, custodial closet. A lot of law enforcement agencies also have minimum safety standards for building too, especially if you are doing this for a law enforcement standpoint. I know when I had an internship with the ATF, our office was located on the second floor of a just commercial office building, but they had to retrofit the entire upstairs to be bomb-proof. Actually, the whole building to be bomb-proof. They had to have a certain grade of tint on the windows on the outside, so they had to work with the landlord to put all that in. They had to put all kinds of extra reinforced steel on the insides of the walls too. They had to put a lot of safety mechanisms for swipe cards and all of that to get into these different offices as well. It was very interesting. You had utilities that you got to think about, like water, electricity, internet, phone. So again, keep in mind here that startup costs typically are higher than recurring cost. But at the end of the day here, though, personnel is going to be your number one expenditure, because you got to pay not only salaries, you got to pay health insurance, you got to pay retirement, you got to pay all kinds of things, right? You have to have sick leave and sick leave pools and all of that. I watched recently, it wasn't Loyola, it was another university's, budget kind of presentation, and they stated that about 70% of their annual operating expenditures goes to personnel. And that's with, again, pay, salary, retirement benefits, all of that. And keep in mind here too, if you don't pay well, not just upfront costs, but especially like benefits like health insurance, retirement, you're going to have retention issues. And when you have retention issues, it's going to increase the cost of staff. It's going to hurt with staff training, and those costs are just going to start mounting at that point too. So then you have to plan to acquire these resources or to reallocate pre-existing resources. So finding the funds to implement your program or policy requires experience, it requires dedication, it requires persistence, and it requires patience. So usually obtaining resources is the responsibility of the change agent. as we've talked about in the earlier lectures, the change agent is the one that is in charge. But typically, again, with the scope of what we're talking about in this class and what a lot of you either are already doing in your jobs or will do in your future jobs, the state, the federal government, or whatever state you're at, the federal government and nonprofit agencies and grants are really the best resource for you. But keep in mind, though, that when you accept money from other people, there's strings attached, right? There's always strings attached to it. And once you start accepting money from other people, they can start telling you what to do. I'll give you an example with this. When I was doing my master's thesis in Louisville, I did it at a halfway house. And I wasn't doing anything with program evaluation, but I was interviewing the volunteers at this halfway house to see like why they volunteered and some other things. And they had gone from around like 4 employees to closer to 8 or 9. They might have even been in the double digits, but they had a full-time psychiatrist on staff. They had a full-time substance use abuse coordinator. And they had a lot of other resources too. And how they got those is that they applied for some federal grants that were available, and they got them. And what they quickly found out is once you accepted this money from the federal government, there's all kinds of strings attached to it. There's extra reporting requirements, which took away from their time doing other things. They also accepted some state money from the state of Kentucky, or I guess it's technically the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And what they did not like with that is that they were able to, since it is a halfway house and you're housing people that are under, most of them, in fact, were under some type of probation or parole supervision. I think all of them were, in fact, when I was there. In order to accept that money, there is a waiver where they can have their premises searched at any time. And so on a couple of occasions, they had a probation officer or parole officer show up at 2 a.m. knocking on the door, which didn't happen often, but they searched everybody's belongings. Whereas there's a lot more protections if somebody's in their private residence. So they didn't like that. So they ended up deciding to forfeit the grant money and not reapply, but by doing so, they had to lay off half their staff. So they lost the staff psychiatrist, which they said was a huge blow to a lot of the men that were in the halfway house because they didn't have mental health counseling at all at that point. So again, there's caveats to all this, right? But they're gonna want results. I was talking again about a few minutes ago about watching a budget presentation of another university, and they were saying that they're glad that the COVID money from when COVID hit and all the federal money there was billions available to keep universities afloat. I know Loyola ended up getting something like, I want to say it was like $50 million or $100 million, and they gave it wasn't that much. It was $10 million. And they gave like half of it to students in some capacity that were students of need. And then the other half went to offset budget losses from like housing and meal plans and things like that. And this other university, not Loyola, was talking about how they're glad that money is not there anymore because they had to jump through so many hoops to be able to report on it to meet their federal needs, that it was way bigger hassle than that university actually needed, which Loyola needed the money. The other university I was talking about didn't necessarily need it. They took it, but they didn't necessarily need it, right? So all that's to say that, again, when you accept money from other people, they're going to want a lot more stuff from you, which can actually burden you in many ways. So when you're thinking about, a timeline, of course, you have to specify dates by which your implementation tasks are going to be accomplished by. So when you're doing a timeline, the first thing is that all the specific implementation activities that need to be accomplished have to be there, right? So think about it like planning your graduation, that, well, I have to take this class in fall of 2024, then I have to take this class in spring of 2025. It's the same idea, right? And it's only offered in that particular semester, but it's the same idea there, right? The second one is that you have to have the assignment of responsibility for each specific task to which individuals are responsible for that. And then lastly, you have to have a specific date by which the task is to be completed. So again, a lot of this stuff is common sense. If you've ever developed any type of plan for yourself or for anyone else, but it's just formalizing it a little bit more. Then you got to develop mechanisms of self-regulation. So this is your internal way of kind of checking your progress, if you will. So everyone in your organization has to understand their roles, and of course they have to be held accountable for their actions. So specifically, you have to have 4 steps of self-regulation. One is that you have to clearly communicate the program's rationale. So again, why it exists, what it hopes to achieve, the values of the program, the intent of the program. As we've talked about before, you have to clarify the staff's job descriptions as well. Third, you have to spell out behavioral expectations, and you have to specify rewards and punishments. So again, if you're doing a reentry program, what they found is positive reinforcement works, right? In some of these reentry programs that I've read about, they will actually have money to give gift cards to individuals that after each month of not having a positive drug test, they will give them a $15, a lot of times it's more than that. It's usually $50 or $100 Walmart gift card. And Walmart's Walmart, right? But you can buy groceries with that. It's something. It's giving you positive reward for not doing something like using drugs, which of course there's a lot more to drug use and abuse than just positive reinforcement. But then you have punishments there as well. What happens if you do get a negative drug test, right? You need to have that there. You need to have that expectation there. Then you have to allow staff to ask questions. So the more understanding from the very beginning, the more buy-in that you have, the better. I talked to you before about the initiative, the mental health initiative that I joined last year in Louisville Metro with one of my friends that's running this entire program. And what we found in our preliminary evaluation of it by talking to all these different entities that are involved is a lot of them don't have a clue what's going on. The very top people do. The people, again, at the very top know. The rest of them don't have a clue what's going on. Sometimes they only know their specific roles. Sometimes they don't even know what their role is supposed to be, right? So having sessions or allowing opportunities for staff to ask questions is only going to be a benefit, because it's going to give them more understanding. It's going to have more buy-in on your program. And the more buy-in you have, the better it's going to be. You also need to have the role of the manager. So for the manager, they have to maintain consistency, that to maintain clear and frequent communication among staff members and between staff and supervisors. Then, of course, they also have to keep an eye on the timeline as well. The manager's the captain of the ship, right? They've got to make sure that everything's running smoothly and that the ship doesn't sink. So you've got to specify that as much as possible. The other thing to keep in mind here is that resistance is not only natural, as much as we hate to admit it, it is inevitable, right? It's going to happen. You are going to have resistance. People don't want to change. People's job duties don't want to change. And you're going to have to deal with that in whatever way you see fit, whether it's, putting somebody in a better role or maybe moving on from them, right? But people are always going to be resistant to change. I see this stuff all the time in the university setting. you've got some old professor that's been doing the same thing since, the 70s, right? Or sometimes before than that. My first year at Loyola, there was a professor on my floor that was like 6 offices down. Father Carter, if anybody knows who he is, but he used to be the president of the university as well for like 10 years. But he fought in World War II, right? And I don't know about him specifically here, but I mean, I started Loyola in 2018, and he fought in World War II, right? And he was one of my colleagues. Of course, and I was born in the late 80s, right? So, if you have somebody in these roles and these positions that have been doing what they've been doing for 20 years or more, they're not gonna like change. Nobody really likes change, but embrace it really as a learning opportunity, really as much as you can. So again, resistance is natural, it's inevitable. Keep that in mind. So that is actually it for this lecture. So again, that's it for action planning. The next lecture, we're going to focus on implementation and monitoring. So as always, if you have any questions, let me know. If not, I'll see you next time.